All right, welcome. Welcome to the latest iteration of the online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm your host, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I co-host this online colloquium along with my Vanderbilt colleague, who's also an assistant professor here, Cassie Dorff. We are associated with the Peace Science Society, and our mission is to bring the kind of great research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Society to all of you all year long. Because of course the great research everyone does continues all year, and our goal is to bring that to you. So today we have a really nice paper from Rob Williams, who's a postdoc at WashU. The paper is entitled "The Curse of Geography: How Governments Preempt Secession Attempts." We have an excellent panel of discussants today. So we have Tanisha Fazal, who's an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, and Bethany Lacina, who's an associate professor at the University of Rochester. So just to kind of remind everyone of our format, Rob will give a presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have some discussion of the paper, and we'll try to wrap up in about an hour. So with that, I'll ask everyone but Rob to mute their mics, and I'll turn it over to you, Rob.
All right, let me share my screen. Thank you to Brad and Cassie for organizing this, and for Peace Science for putting on this series. It's a really great opportunity to get some extra feedback on my work outside of the regular annual meeting. And thank you to Tanisha and Bethany for graciously agreeing to serve as discussants today. I'm very excited to hearing your feedback on this project. So this project is an attempt to try and explain what I see as a puzzle in the literature on civil war and separatism. So if we look at this plot, it is sort of trends in self-determination movements and armed separatist conflict from 1960 onward. So this is using Kathleen Cunningham's self-determination movement data, and then Kathleen and Jess Braithwaite's data on rebel group emergence and the goals that rebel groups fight for. And we can see that there's this consistent pattern of a gap between self-determination movements writ large and specifically violent armed separatist conflicts. And when we sort of dig a little more into the literature on separatism and armed conflict, this gap becomes even more puzzling. And it's especially puzzling. We see it increases the number of separatist movements after 1990, largely associated with the breakup of the Soviet Union. But we see that there's actually a slight decline in the number of armed separatist conflicts, despite the popular narrative that the breakup of the Soviet Union was really responsible for a large increase in what were at the time often called new wars. So, like I said, this becomes even more puzzling when we look at some of the findings in the Civil War literature. So we know that minority groups, focusing specifically here on ethnic groups, are more likely to engage in secessionist violence when they are faced with a weak state, so where sort of insurgency is an easy tactic of conflict, where the state isn't able to resist it. When they are politically excluded, so they're shut out from the political process, they don't have access to redress of grievances. And finally, when they are located far from the capital, because it's often hard for the government to monitor, keep tabs, or put down a rebellion if it does emerge. And so I'm really interested in trying to explain why we witness so few separatist civil wars, despite the frequency of these causes. And to really illustrate that last point, this is a plot of the distribution of ethnic groups and where they live relative to the capital of their countries. And it's split up by whether they are politically included or excluded. And we can see that excluded groups, on average, tend to live a good deal farther from the capital than included groups. We can see that the mean of this distribution is considerably higher. So I'm really trying to explain why we see fewer active separatist civil wars, given this sort of empirical pattern of grievance and physical location in the world. So I think to answer this question, we need to sort of take a step back and think about sovereignty and statehood and what those concepts mean, because separatist rebel groups, if they are successful, and they manage to win their conflict, they have to actually become independent sovereign states and members of the international state system. So we know sort of generally that sovereignty is thought to have both an internal capacity dimension and an external legal recognition dimension. And so lots of scholars have done great work recently on the ways in which rebel groups try and seek that external recognition, things like signing treaties on the laws of conflict, having diplomatic missions, but that's sort of really out of their hands. They have a little more control over the capacity and what happens inside of their state. And we know from the state formation literature that statehood, successful sovereignty, requires overcoming both internal and external rivalries. And this story has largely been told in terms of institutions, where certain political institutions make this process easier and then lead to more successful new states. However, we also know that resources play a key role in the success of newfound states, whether they are able to sort of fund the basic necessities and requirements of governance and bureaucracy. So whether they are able to have a civil service, provide public goods to their people, and if we're thinking about overcoming external rivals, whether they have the resources to maintain some sort of national defense to preempt these challengers from the outside and to consolidate their rule inside. So I'm going to focus today on thinking about the role that resources play in this story. So states are territorial entities, and resources are geographically distributed within the borders of those entities. They're not sort of all concentrated in one place. And so we can think of, places where oil deposits are located, where agricultural fields are located, minerals. We can think of cities and the sort of capital that comes with those, with investment and industry. And all of these things are geographically located. Human geography also matters greatly for this. Tax revenue is a large source of capital for many states. We can think about the infrastructure of the state and how it makes it easier or harder to get around and police and administer and govern that territory. And also terrain also plays a role with that, affecting how easy it is to access and rule the territory of a potential state. So I'm going to argue that minority groups are more likely to try and secede when the geography of their territory is more governable. I often refer to this as this idea of territorial governability. And the basic idea is, take a given ethnic group, the territory they inhabit. If they were to, by fiat, become an independent state tomorrow, how easy or difficult would it be to govern that independent state given the territory that it would encompass? However, this sort of governability question is not, you can't make it happen by fiat. You have to think about the existing state. Lots of these minority groups live in current states, which I will refer to as host states. So we can think of the Biafrans in Nigeria, the Basques in Spain, and this existing government is also going to affect the relationship between the governability of a territory and whether secession is a decision worth taking, a cause worth fighting for. So we can think about the sort of geographic distance between this ethnic group territory and the government, the sort of centers of state power. And the closer this ethnic group territory gets to the government, two things happen. So one is that it will be harder to win a separatist conflict. We've seen lots of research on this, that states are more capable at fighting wars closer at home. It's easier to project forces out. And then the flip side is that even if they do win this separatist conflict and become independent, they now have to deal with their former host state. And the closer you are, the more difficult this former host state can make life for the new state. So they can, impose border crossings. If the minority group territory wouldn't have its own international border, if it's fully contained within the territory of the host state, they can make international commerce and exchange really difficult. And if they decided to either wage a war or support sort of armed militant groups, it's easier for them to do that the closer they are. So I'm going to argue that the effect of governability, so how governable an ethnic group's territory is on whether or not they decide to initiate a separatist conflict, is going to be higher beyond the reach of the state. Because even if you have a eminently governable territory that you would love to have a sovereign independent state in, if you are right in the backyard of a very powerful state, it's going to be sort of difficult to be independent, and the costs of fighting may not outweigh the sort of downsides of this newfound independence. Given this, governments can take a few actions. So I've argued so far that this sort of governability of a territory is, largely geographic that I'm focusing on. Obviously, institutions still matter, but I'm looking at the geographic piece. And geography is relatively easy to observe, even for weak governments. And so they may not know who is loyal to the government or not. They may not know the sort of degree of organization and potential sedition occurring within a territory, but they are able to sort of observe the territories that are the best candidate for independent governance. And so then I'm going to argue they can use this knowledge to try and preempt any secession attempts in these most governable regions. There are sort of two strategies governments can take in response to separatist risk. So the first is providing public goods. We see this often in sort of more industrialized countries. A great example is the devolved parliament in Scotland due to the sort of Scottish oil wealth. Or they can increase security forces to try and clamp down on any emergent separatist movement. And I think that China's actions in Xinjiang are kind of a prototypical example of this, where they've massively increased the size of the police force. They've built police stations everywhere. They've rigged up CCTV cameras on every street corner, and they're basically tracking the movement of every Uyghur citizen in Xinjiang. And they've placed, large numbers of Uyghurs in re-education camps. So these are sort of the two strategies governments can use. I'm not at this project really looking at the decision between these two strategies, but I think one thing that could sort of largely explain which direction they're going to go is a bit of a path dependence argument, where if governments already have a repressive, coercive apparatus, then using repression might make more sense. But if they've sort of developed a more federal system where they're sort of buying off potential challengers, that could be the more natural way to go to sort of continue the program in that direction. So this leads me to my hypothesis, which is that the effect of governability on state capacity should be increasing in distance from the state. This is that state capacity is a reflection of the government's assessed secession risk in that region. And so that state capacity should be higher in more governable regions farther from the state than more governable regions closer to the nexus of state power. To measure these concepts, I'm going to use a sample of all ethnic group years from 1992 to 2013. So these are the GeoEPR data out of ETH. We have polygons for each ethnic group territory, so we can sort of look at the specific territory they would be governing if they were an independent state. My response variable is going to be nightlights, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a slightly novel use of the nightlights data. And to explain the level of nightlights in a given group territory year, I'm going to use population as my measure of governability, because human capital, like I've said, is a really, really important key component of these states. It provides both physical, like monetary capital, but also the sort of citizenship that justifies the nationalist project. It's easily observable at a global level for this sample, which is really nice. And then I'm just going to operationalize distance from the state as distance from the capital, because that's what's often been done in this literature. And then I have some sort of standard controls, which I'm happy to talk about in the discussion. So using nightlights to measure state capacity is a bit original. They're often used to measure sort of economic activity writ large. State capacity and economic activity are very tied up, but nightlights, what they actually measure is electricity and electrification. So we know from some comparative research that electrification is often a tool of state outreach, where central governments will sort of extend electrical grids to outlying areas to bring sort of more control and certainty to these areas. And they also actually directly correlate with many measures of state capacity, such as tax revenue at the local level, number of health clinics, number of security force personnel in provinces, and more sort of census-based measures of state capacity that look at the quality of information that a government has in a given region. So these are my primary results. Since we're working with an interaction term here, we can see that looking at the x-axis, we have logged and scaled capital distance. So even though it's negative, this is just a sort of rescaling of capital distance. And on the y-axis, we have the marginal effect of population on nightlights. So this is saying as we get farther from the capital, more populous areas become even more luminous, suggesting that governments are developing their capacity in these areas. So one comment that I've gotten in previous reviews from reviewers is that there could be some alternative process that's driving both population and nightlights, say capacity, say potentially that the centers of countries are very populated, very densely populated where the capital is, and then border regions are very populated because these are sources of economic exchange where trade happens cross-border, and the middle of the countries are relatively empty. So this increasing effect relationship between population and nightlights and state capacity is really just an artifact of other socio-political factors that are driving settlement patterns. So to try and address some of these concerns, I have conducted what I'm calling a geographic placebo test, where the unit of analysis right now is an inherently political unit because it is ethnic group territories. So if we move to a non-political unit and this positive relationship between population, capital distance, and nightlights persists, that would suggest that there is actually some third factor driving both of these. So what I've done is I've replicated this analysis, instead using the Prio grid data, which just divides the world up into a series of grids. So these are inherently apolitical units, and I've measured the exact same independent variables and conducted that analysis, and we see that there's actually the opposite relationship here. So when we just look at grid cells and not these political units that are ethnic group territories, we see that as you get farther from the capital, the relationship between population and nightlights actually decreases. So I think this suggests that there is sort of a strategic process at play here generating these findings. So to wrap up, we find that the effect of population on nightlights is increasing in distance from the capital, which I believe suggests that state capacity is higher in these secession-prone regions. And looking at this geographic placebo test showing that the opposite result is true for apolitical units, I think provides much more confidence in this. However, nightlights are an imperfect measure, so I have some other work that more directly investigates this mechanism, which lends support to the theory, where I look at shocks to governability in different territory and how governments respond to that. And then some qualitative case study work where I look at governments sort of deliberately relocating their supporters to these minority group territories in a way to try and preempt these separatist conflicts, or if not preempt them, at least weaken them and be informed about their comings and goings. So thank you very much, and I'm very excited to hear your comments.
All right, thanks, Rob. Everybody, remember, make sure you unmute your mics, because I've more than once continued to talk and realized that I was speaking into silence. So we'll, I guess I'll just go ahead and turn it over to our discussant. So I don't know if Tanisha or Bethany, if one of you wants to get us kicked off with a discussion of the paper.
I mean, I can start.
Okay.
We talked about this before. I have like comments written out that I'll send you, Rob, but Bethany, we also agreed that we'll do it seminar style. So please just, jump in. All right. So I think there's a lot to like about the paper, Rob. And I like the motivating question of why we have this gap, like what you have a lot of clever subtitles in the paper. So why do we have so few secessionists given increasing incentives for secessionism? Although really what you're talking about is why do we have so little violent secessionism? And I think that's something that it's a little slippery in the paper and the way that it's presented. And I had some trouble figuring out exactly where you were on that. And that's an easy fix. I think the theory and the empirics are creative, and the empirics are especially carefully and well done. I think you could retitle the paper "Turning the Lights On for Would-Be Secessionists." Like there are a lot of fun title options that you could play around with. But I'll just start with the theoretical part and say that I think you have to do. I mean, for me, I needed more evidence that nighttime lights are really a result of central government investment. And I think you did a better job of showing that or arguing for that in the presentation than you do in the paper. I think that is also something that's not that hard, because and part of the reason I was a little bit skeptical about that was because a lot of times secessionist movements are on international borders. And so I could imagine that electricity actually comes from some third party. Or there might be other kinds of investment. I don't know anything about how electrical grids work, but I do know how resource transfers can work with respect to potential secessionist movements. And so this is something that I think, again, is an easy fix. But where I was a little bit less convinced was with respect to this logic that this kind of investment by central governments, assuming that is in fact where the investment is coming from, is necessarily going to, or is especially more likely to deter rather than enable secessionism. So I could see a potential secessionist group either developing infrastructure, as I said, perhaps with support from a third party, or being more likely to secede, having like a downstream effect of infrastructural development could lead to additional capacity that enables potential secessionists to actually take over or to maintain or develop their own infrastructural capacity. Alternatively, and contra some of the logic that you propose on page 6 of the paper, I'm not necessarily convinced, just looking at the data and the cases I know of secessionists, that would-be secessionists are generally encouraged or discouraged by either governability or infrastructure. Like I could see this going either way. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and say, Bethany, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, do you want to jump in or do you want me to keep going?
Well, so slightly, or the bigger point that this starts to get towards for me is ultimately your dependent variable is not going to be rebellion, it's going to be state preemption of a rebellion. And the first part of the paper spends a lot of time telling us about the decision-making process of secessionists, and kind of inviting the reader to argue with you about that, when ultimately we're not, like, obviously, I 100% agree the governments need to be thinking about the secessionist thought process, but like the first part of the paper seems to be to pick a lot of non-essential fights. I'm a little concerned about the puzzle for similar reasons to Nisha, in that it's really not a puzzle unless you can show me that the probability of success conditional on conflict is so much higher than the probability of success conditional on mobilization. And the probability of success is very, very low, no matter which one. So I'm not convinced you can show me that that's puzzling. But again, it's not essential to what you're ultimately going to do. So reworking that start of the paper to like not invite so many quibbles would help.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to jump in and say that I completely agree. This is going to be like my last big point. So, which is that I think the paper needs to be reframed, because it is, you're kind of leading us along the garden path, and we're expecting that the dependent variable in your model is going to be secessionism in some form or another, and it's not. I mean, I read the paper twice because I was so surprised the first time when that didn't happen. And so, I mean, you have a finding, but the connection between that finding and the ultimate outcome of really violent secessionism, which is theoretically what you're interested in, is so attenuated that I just don't think you can get there from here.
Yeah, I agree. I just chime in, like, to sort of echo this. When I was reading through, I think it sort of gets lost in because you're telling a strategic story, right? And understanding your strategic story from the perspective of the government requires you to think ahead about what the separatists are going to do. But I agree. I got to the empirics and I had to go back to the beginning because I expected the outcome variable to be, secession or secessionist attempts or something like that. And it made sense once I went back and sort of looked at it again. But I agree. I think the framing, you could almost invert it.
And just to add to Bethany, a point that Bethany was making, which is another one that I agree with, you're not, so there are 2 points. One is that secessionists don't actually, or would-be secessionists don't have a lot of agency in this, in at least the part of the story that you're telling here, which I think is problematic, especially because it's a strategic story. But, there's a really important third party, which, again, I think you did a better job laying out some of this in the presentation than in the paper, which is, the international system, right? Like the ether of the international system on some level. And, when you show that the chart in figure 2 of the paper with the lines of secessionism and violent secessionism and the gap between them, and I look at that and I think, oh, well, I know what the answer is to that. I mean, I know that secessionism is generally unlikely to succeed, and that violent secessionism is also not particularly likely to succeed. It might be marginally more likely to succeed than nonviolent secessionism. It's a very maybe we're going from like 0.01 to 0.02. And also you have this shift in the 1990s, which is when your data starts. And this is a time when the United Nations Security Council and other international organizations are sending very clear signals precisely as a result of this jump in secessionist movements in both the former Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, saying we don't want unilateral declarations of independence. Like, they are being super clear about this. We're hiding the key to the clubhouse, essentially. And so I think would-be secessionists and actual secessionists also they're receiving some of these signals, and we know for a fact that they talk to each other as well. So especially if what you're interested in is violent secessionism, then I really think you have to at least acknowledge that. So you have to acknowledge that there were Catalans at the Scottish referendum, like the day of the Scottish referendum. They were there in full costume. I mean, there's a football league called what is it called, CONIFA, I think, that Ryan Griffiths, who's another scholar of secessionism, goes to every year. where they have they have a World Cup essentially. So they're sharing information with each other, and that international aspect in terms of both existing states who are the ones who can offer the brass ring of international recognition, and the communication among secessionists themselves is it's critical to your story, but it's also missing in the paper.
So Rob, maybe if you want to take a minute to respond to some of the comments so far.
Yeah, definitely. No, I absolutely agree that sort of the international story is really key, and I've kind of left it out so far because I felt like there was already too much stuff in here. But I think, potentially reframing the opening to be a bit more state focused would open up some space to do that. And I've sort of thought another element of the international community that's really important is sort of not just the norm of territorial integrity that you talked about, but this idea that if you become independent, you're sort of very weak and vulnerable as a new state, and kind of the neighborhood you would emerge into, and sort of how likely it is that you might face challenges not from your former host state but from the state next door, and how that sort of informs and conditions these decisions.
Have you read Yaroslav Tyr's work?
No, not yet.
So he's written on precisely that.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it's so I think sort of going back to the current framing of the paper, I think Brad hit the nail on the head, that I was trying to think strategically and tell a strategic story and really be aware of the government's perceptions of the rebels' motivations. But I think that you're probably both right that there's a way to reframe this and make this much more of a government story, because we always have governments have resources they want to hold on to. They have sort of key territories they want to hold on to. And I think that could be a very fruitful way of sort of reframing this, tightening it up, and probably bringing in a bit of the international story. Although, as you point out, that my data begin basically like after this sort of norm has shifted in the world community. So if you have any suggestions for how to bring that into the story while there's sort of less variation in it in these data, that would be awesome.
So I did some analyses looking at historical trends and declarations of independence by secessionist group. That's in one of the chapters of my 2018 book. So that those data might be helpful for you.
Definitely, thank you.
I had another question for you, and this is to some extent a naive question, which is, why don't you, and I know that you're kind of following the literature on this, so it's as much a question for the literature as it is for you, but why not include a variable maybe interacted with distance from the capital for whether there's an international border of this polygon?
Yeah, so I did that in previous analyses, and it actually sort of, I sliced it a bunch of different ways, and it never really seemed to have a significant effect. It did once or twice, but it was not really robust. I don't think I've tried interacting it. That's a really good suggestion. I was just sort of including it on its own, but that was sort of absolutely like something that I thought about, and I think potentially, yeah, like that interaction could be the missing part of the story, because again, if you have this border but you're 10 kilometers from the capital, they're not really worried about losing control.
Yeah, I don't know how critical it would be. I'm not necessarily arguing that it would be, but to me, it doesn't make sense that you're going to have a secessionist movement like, Tatarstan versus Chechnya, right?
Yeah.
We know which one's more likely. So.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That was a very big oversight on my part thus far, because I'd like thought about that, but I didn't even think about the like conditional effect there. Yeah, I agree that I could definitely sell the sort of measure of nightlights as state capacity a little bit better in the paper. And I think, definitely taking some of the things from the presentation there is a good way to do that. But
Can I
Yeah, go ahead.
talk on that point?
Yes.
So in the discussion, I think there's a little bit of a traffic jam between what you're calling governability, which is going to be population, reach of the state, which is distance to the capital, and then preemption by the state / state capacity, which is nightlights. And a really generous reader can hold off on saying, wait, these are all the same thing. You can't move one without changing the other two. But I mean, I always encourage people to never imagine you have a generous reader. One of the first things that strikes me is that there's a pretty strong, or it's already kind of a practice because of the ETH people to treat population as the potential for rebellion, which is just power, or it's like latent military capacity. From the point of view of the state, population is a threat because it incentivizes secession, or population is just a threat is not that different a story. And in a paper about the state treating population more like the rest of the literature does, may be quite helpful. When you work back around to the parts of your research agenda that are about the point of view of the secessionists, I think you have a lot to do to kind of explain how state capacity, when the state builds capacity, it should be increasing governability, and therefore, as Nisha said, by your own story, it's both making secessionism maybe logistically more difficult, but more rewarding in the long term. You know, so the very similar concepts that are bumping up against each other is I think a difficulty in this paper.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me that. That was like point number one I meant to get to and totally forgot since you both raised it. Yeah, in this project, I really can't sort of disaggregate what that capacity is. I've got some sort of ideas for follow-on work where I'm thinking about differences between sort of more durable state capacity and more temporary state capacity. So, you know, whether governments are building capacity by building roads and schools and sort of things that can be really easily expropriated by a rebel group, or whether they're sort of providing more soft public goods. So whether they're, you know, increasing welfare spending or something like that, where it's then very easy for the government to cut off that tap and not have it sort of incentivize separatism. I think you're absolutely right that like a lot of public good spending can sort of make separatism more likely. And then I actually, in one of the qualitative look at this, it's one of the cases I look at is Iraqi Kurdistan. And basically, you know, everything that Saddam did in Kurdistan would make separatism much more attractive because, you know, they're building schools, sort of new cities, more oil infrastructure, but they are very much, you know, kicking Kurds out of their villages and increasing military presence. And so sometimes the strategy sort of seems to be, we're going to increase capacity, but we're going to keep such a tight hold on things that we're probably going to start a low level, you know, sons of the soil type conflict, but we're going to prefer that happening and us being aware rather than being caught unaware by like a declaration of armed separatism. And so I think that you only see the sort of more durable forms of public goods in cases where the state is confident that they can keep enough military presence there to really prevent any new separatist movement from emerging, armed separatist movement.
I wonder if part of the problem or part of the challenge here, I don't really have a good answer, a suggestion for how precisely to solve this, is just simply the terminology that you're using. That when I hear governability, I don't necessarily think of it just in terms of separatists. Like the kind of infrastructural development or extension that you're talking about with respect to electrical grids also potentially could mean governability, just in a common language sense or an ordinary language sense. And so I think part of the problem, so part of it is these conceptual relationships that are very much connected that both Bethany and I have pointed to, but also part of it is that there's this overlap in the language and the way people think about how these terms are defined that you actually want to separate, and you maybe need to use more precise language to do that.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. That's a very helpful suggestion. Definitely something I need to think about. Thank you.
Have you read Melissa Lee's work?
Yes.
Okay.
That's actually one of the things that's for the correlation with nightlights and governance is she actually very generously shared the subnational census-based measure of state capacity with me. And so that's where that comes from.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I think it's very much like a similar story.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thinking about how does this sound in ordinary language is a really good tip. In ordinary language, by definition, governability has to be inversely related to the probability of violence. Like anything that's not inversely related to the probability of violence against the state can't be governability.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you get the reader to go down the garden path with you to a world where that's not necessarily true, great. But I just wonder if you're just like inviting people to resist the project when you frame things like that.
Yeah, I've thought about using like potential governability or something, but that's clunky and again doesn't really get away from that. But yeah, I think you're definitely right that there's some terminology that I need to overcome that I'm currently relying on.
Even talking about it, potential governability, I think I at least assumed where you were going with that was how are the rebels going to put down challengers to themselves someday? But what that's the story you're telling is really much more about just like how much revenue is sitting there.
It almost seems like, this may not be a term you want to use, but it's sort of in your story. It's their perceived value of the territory, right? That's sort of how I read it.
Yeah, it's definitely a good suggestion to retitle that.
I think also another thing to consider, and where I think the theory could be tightened just generally, is that you have a series of outcomes here. One is a secessionist movement is formed. Second is that movement chooses to use violence. Third is that movement, down the line perhaps actually gains recognition and so is successful in that sense. And then fourth, that movement, that new state has to then face its own challenges of governing. And you're incorporating elements of all of those stages into this one story, and they happen at very different times. They're conditional. Each of them is typically conditional on having passed the previous stage.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like I'm a planner, and so I always think, okay, well, if this, then this, then this, and this, and this, and then, but you've got like the cart, you've got so many carts before one horse. And I think you can pull back on that, and that will help you tighten this up.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that sort of a framing of, just states thinking strategically and trying to protect what's theirs and protect valuable resources is a much easier story for readers to follow and gets away from that problem where you're having to think 4 steps down the tree.
I have a, why aren't you making this more like my research question?
All right.
So it's correct to say that you don't know that these populations are the ethnic group, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So of course my mind went immediately towards moving population into an area as a means of suppression.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any way to kind of net out abnormal population increases and or look at only at population at T equals the distant past, because I mean I think of population as one potential tool of repression / state
so
control.
I've definitely thought along those lines. I have in the qualitative work, like I said, I've looked at that. I looked also at Sri Lanka and sort of the importation of Sinhalese citizens into Tamil areas. But I'd kind of been stuck about trying to think about this in a more cross-national quantitative sense. I really like the idea of looking at large population changes, because before the only data I could think of were the Carl Mueller-Krippon's new African ethnic groups data, which is really, really fine-grained and much better than the GeoEPR, but it's Africa and it's very temporally limited. Something about thinking, because we know we have the centuries-old population estimates, so those and some sort of looking at change, that's a really excellent idea, because I absolutely agree that population can be a tool for repression, because in Xinjiang, in addition to all these police, they're also just getting massive numbers of Han Chinese to relocate there. So that's a really, really great idea for how to try and think about that within this analytical framework. So thank you.
And aren't they also in Xinjiang moving Uyghurs out?
Yes.
So there's inward and outward movement.
Yeah.
I wondered I'm curious what other people think about this. I wonder if insofar as you're trying to get this out sooner rather than later, there's so much work to be done on the theoretical end that I wonder if this is better as a research note that has sort of, you don't have to forward this very elaborate, it's so elaborate and it really strains the reader, I think, the theoretical story that you're telling, but the empirics, which I'll admit I can speak a little bit less to me seem solid. So I wonder if there's a way to reframe it and submit it as a research note, and if timing is what you're concerned about from a professional strategic perspective.
Yeah, timing is definitely a concern. No, it's a really interesting idea. I think that's definitely doable. I think that would sort of be the extreme version of the theoretical reframing that I'm thinking of right now, is basically, 3 paragraphs on states are concerned about this stuff, states want to monitor this stuff. That's a really interesting idea. I'll have to think through the trade-offs of trying to reframe the whole front end, but I think it could definitely be a good case for that. Thank you for that suggestion.
For what it's worth, I think research notes are becoming increasingly common, and if you can publish one in a good journal, then I don't see people getting dinged for research notes in a way that maybe they were used to. And a lot of times there are many. I think the only problem is that a lot of times, I'm just trying to think out a strategy for you out loud. A lot of times research notes now are kind of like mini papers, and so in that respect it might not work, but it might still, timing wise, it might be a better strategy to at least give a shot.
With my experience so far, the review turnaround is usually a lot faster. So if it doesn't work out, I will find that out faster than sending it out as a regular article at the very least.
Whether it ends up being short enough for a research note or not, I do think making it a more empirical paper is the way to go. And I'd lean a little harder on the placebo test. That is the sort of, I think, most intriguing part of the empirical work. The more powerful placebo test, I think, would be to get administrative units, not grid cells, as the unit of analysis, and show that this relationship is conditional on ethnic difference, that
Yes.
the state doesn't do things this way in Han Chinese areas. Like England looks one way, right? Like light is concentrated in London and just sort of fades as a function of distance. But then when you have a periphery you want to control. So I think administrative units would be a more powerful set of placebos. You also, in the placebo context, should, I think, bring back in Nisha's idea about interacting on the borderness with distance to the capital. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the code to do it with administrative units is actually running on the cluster right now. But I love the framing of like it's conditional on ethnicity because I had the intuition that administrative units are probably a slightly better placebo test, but I couldn't quite articulate why. And the fact that like it's not fully apolitical, but it's away from ethnicity, and I love that framing. So thank you very much. Yeah, I think definitely whichever route the article goes, I think there's definitely room to expand the empirics there, and that'd be a very fruitful avenue and talk about like border relationships as well.
It's great when everybody wants you to do the same thing. I'm so happy for you.
It's true.
Hopefully the reviewers will ask you to do the same thing.
We can hope. Trying to see if I have any other questions.
Yeah, we're coming up just on an hour. I think we've got like 4 or 5 minutes left. So, any last thoughts?
No, I think I'm good with any lingering questions I had based on the feedback. Okay,
great. We'll wrap it up, and if there's any other thoughts we want to share, we can take them offline. All right, I want to thank Rob for presenting this excellent work. I look forward to seeing it out as a research note, paper, or otherwise. I want to thank Tanisha and Bethany for great comments. I think this will be really useful. Really useful for Rob. So as a reminder, we're going to be off for just a few weeks here at the Online Peace Science Colloquium. And so we'll be back on April 3rd with Sarah Fox from the University of Pittsburgh. She's going to be presenting a paper called International Influence on the Policy and Practice of Post-Conflict Women's Rights. I don't know if Rob had any last thoughts before we sign off.
No, just wanted to say thanks to the Society for running this, and thank you very much, Bethany and Nisha, for these excellent comments.
Thanks to Brad for organizing.
Yes, thank you, Brad.
Yes.
Happy to do so.
Yes.
Cool. Well, as a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, where you are likely watching this now, but we're also on Apple Podcasts, all your favorite ways to download podcasts. You can find us there. Also, you can read the papers, including Rob's paper, on our website. And also, if you're interested in contributing as a discussant, we're always happy to have excellent discussants on. So send Cassie and I an email, and we'll try to have you on. Until next time, thanks for tuning in.